Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the third in our 2022 midterm seminar series here at the Center for Social Media and Politics. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Social Media and Politics and a professor of politics here at NYU. Our goal with this seminar series has been to bring together leading scholars to present new and in-progress research on the intersection of social media, policy, and democracy in advance of the 2022 US midterms. This is the third of our 4 sessions. We'll have one again next Wednesday. If you missed the first 2, they're available. You can find them on our website. And I'm really excited about today's conversation. This has been a big week for me personally in terms of introductions. On Monday, I got to introduce Mikhail Baryshnikov at an event, but today I get to introduce Kevin Munger, a former CSMAP PhD student who's now an assistant professor at Penn State and is here to give a talk about his new book, Generation Gap: Why the Baby Boomers Still Dominate American Politics and Culture. It's amazing to have Kevin back here. And I'm also super excited that to moderate this conversation, we've been able to recruit Charlotte Alter, a senior correspondent at Time, who's going to serve as our moderator. Charlotte is also the author of The Ones We've Been Waiting For: How a Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. I'm extremely excited to listen to this conversation, and we're going to turn it over first to Charlotte, who will then introduce the rest of the session. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Kevin.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having us. Kevin, I just want to hold up your book so everyone can see it. I really love this book, and I have to say, you know, as somebody who my book came out like 2 years ago. It was also about generational change. And I just want to start off by saying I feel like you've done a real service here, because there's a ton of data in this book that I was looking for when I wrote my book. So I just feel like you've really provided real clarity and found and sort of crunched some of these numbers that I can tell you did not exist until this book came out, because I spent years looking for them. So thank you for that. I just want to start off by, help us understand the main argument that you're making here. I mean, I think many people, myself included, sort of assumed, okay, a lot of these baby boomers are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They're on their way out. A new generation is ascendant. Why is that not true?
Right. They are on the way out. I think the time scale is what trips people up. That it's a number of factors which have all combined to give this one particular generation, the baby boom generation, disproportionate power and staying power. So the thesis of the book is somewhat different from the work I usually do, where you're trying to identify a single cause and effect story. And instead, the reason I decided to write a book, my first one like this, is that there are a number of different causes which have been playing out on the time cycle of decades, which have produced all of this demographic weight in this one generation, which is then multiplied by their economic success, control of the major institutions, and their political overrepresentation. And so now we're dealing with ultimately a good thing, this fact that we have significantly extended the lifespan, and especially the healthy lifespan for the average person. But this means that this boomer dominance is persisting longer than it otherwise would, and that the kind of natural life cycle of generational replacement is thrown off as a result.
So take me into this, because this is one of the things that I feel like you articulated and explored so well, the importance of lengthening lifespans in generational analysis. Is it just that baby boomers are living longer than earlier generations did? Why is it that they have this staying power that, by the time they're done will have lasted for maybe more than a half century, right?
Well, I mean, it begins 50 years ago when they were entering into these institutions which grew and to kind of build the post-war American boom. So in the case of academia, for example, I think that the top-heavy nature of employment in academia among professors is even more distinct than in almost any other discipline. And this is because there was a kind of golden age of higher education in the US, right because they needed to educate the later baby boomers. And so as these institutions were growing, we had this one generation all having access to the positions of power. And they also got rid of what had been a longstanding rule in the US and is a rule in many other countries where you have mandatory retirement age. So as a result of some of the civil rights legislation and the extension of this kind of change, they were also the first generation to not be removed automatically when they hit a certain age, and so they're not being kicked out like they otherwise would have.
Charlotte, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muting because my baby is here and she's making some noise in the background. But Kevin, I understand that you have some visuals to help people understand the real the data that you have so amazingly collected here. Why don't we launch into that?
Sure. I actually was not sure that was the case, so I do have a slide deck prepared, and I can pull that up. So while I'm doing that, perhaps we can continue the conversation.
Oh, great. Okay. Great. So, I mean, I found that, one of the things that that I loved about this book was that, I think a lot of people know that boomers are still dominant in our society, in our culture, but there's not a lot of exploration as to why. So, that's one of the things that I just feel like you were able to collect all this really persuasive data to explain why this generation has a staying power that, earlier generations didn't and subsequent generations may not. How much, I see there's a question here from the audience, as you collect your slides and get ready for your visual part of the presentation, how much of that do you think is because baby boomers also have a tremendous amount of financial dominance and they just simply have more wealth than younger generations do?
Yeah, that's absolutely a big part of it. So they experienced decades of economic growth, and they had access to the kind of traditional vehicle for the accumulation of wealth throughout the lifespan, which is getting into the engine of prosperity of owning a home. And so here, I think it's actually really important to talk about the racial distinctions, whereas a lot of the white baby boomers in the post-war era were able to take advantage of the GI Bill, or the parents were anyway, and to start this accumulation of generational wealth. A lot of the Black baby boomers were not. They were denied access to this and to the subsidized higher education, which has been also important for developing human capital, which is part of the interplay with the economic advantages. And so by breaking it down by race, we can really see the specific mechanisms that allowed the baby boomers to flourish, the white ones who did anyway. And on the higher education front, certainly now younger generations are more educated than ever, and that might turn out well for them, although we'll see exactly if the value of college education is the same as it once was. But on the housing question, it really is dramatically distinct, and it is a pretty significant problem for millennials everywhere. I think are coming to realize that housing is like a defining issue for our generation, and that this is not that it has not historically been a national political issue. It's more of a state and local issue. But since it's happening everywhere, it has become a kind of national concern for millennials who are not able to begin this wealth accumulation process.
Great. So why don't we can just keep talking, and I want to let you get a chance to get your slide deck up. Just let me know when you're ready.
I'm good to go.
Okay, great.
So let me just share my screen. So this talk is the whole talk. I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights here for I think that are relevant for the conversation. So first is the kind of can you all see the screen? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Good. Sorry, great. First, I want to talk about my kind of central theoretical intervention. I'm coining this phrase, attempting to anyway, boomer ballast. So one thing I've learned is the kind of central importance of alliteration in cementing someone's theory. And so I came up with this. And as a kind of formula for how I've arrived at boomer ballast, it is all of these different trends which are overlapping and mutually reinforcing. So we begin by the demographic heft of the baby boomers. This is multiplied by their individual economic prosperity, which then becomes multiplied by their disproportionate political power on the demand side in terms of the voting booth. This is also multiplied by a cultural hegemony and their kind of dominance of the cultural landscape. And then the control of the major institutions are all interlocking components of boomer ballast. And so briefly, what do I mean by ballast? And I, in fact, had intended to make this the title of the book, but my publisher was concerned that not everyone would know what the word ballast means. And I think that's fair. So I want to kind of drill down on this point because I'm intentionally trying to make this non-normative. So it's not necessarily good or bad. So we consider the metaphor, going back to Plato, of the ship of state. So the idea is that the governance is not really the same thing as changing the direction of a car or on foot. The ship of state has a lot of momentum. And so what we know about navigating a ship is you can't just turn on a dime, and that there are forces, the ocean, the water, which are affecting the ship at all times. So the task of the steersman, the person who's sailing the ship, is to adapt to both the historical forces which have given you the momentum and to the changing conditions of the water. And so ballast is the bit at the bottom here, the extra weight at the bottom of the ship, which has two functions. The primary advantage is that it makes the ship more stable. Adding extra ballast makes the changing conditions less likely to tip the ship over. But it also makes it harder to steer in the sense that it makes it less responsive. So the more ballast you have, the more stable, and thus the less changing the ship of state. And so what I mean by boomer ballast is that right now we have a particularly ballast heavy society. We have a lot of weight stored up in this one generation, which makes our society unusually stable, but also makes it less quick to change with changing conditions. So there's not the case that you have you always want more ballast or you always want less. It's not something to really optimize, but it's one of the crucial inputs to how you should be able to steer the ship. And so this is the kind of metaphor I'm working with to try to make our demographic situation more legible. All right. So I'm just going to run through the graphs here pretty quick, because I do want to focus on the conversation. But in terms of building up my story about demographic hefts, the first component is the age pyramid. So we see here in 1960, the very distinct baby boom generation at the bottom. And of course, this is called an age pyramid because historically it has looked like a pyramid. So deviations from the standard pyramidal shape are new and anomalous. Now we have something very different. Looks more like a age pagoda than an age pyramid, where we have still the baby boom visible at the near the top, and then a second band here with the millennials, who were originally called the echo baby boomers. So the fact that there are more baby boomers has meant that they have more children, not per person, but just because there were more of them to begin with. And so this demographic reality is a crucial input to a lot of American politics today. It's also, as I say, intensely correlated with age. So the baby boomer generation was the whitest generation in the history of the United States. This has most to do with the changing patterns of immigration, but it's important to note how quickly the demographic makeup of the country has shifted in the lifetime of this one baby boomer generation. So in terms of their own lived experience, many of them did grow up in ethnically homogenous neighborhoods and have seen a radical change in the ethnic and racial composition of the country. We see this also with the number of immigrants in the country. So the US had long been a nation of immigrants where we had 15% foreign born as the kind of average throughout most of the late 19th, early 20th century. And then starting in the 1910s, 1920s, they radically shut down immigration, in particular from non-white countries, non-European countries. And so at this kind of peak of the baby boomers' youth is really the low point of foreign-born population in the United States. So again, this has changed quite dramatically in their lifespan. In terms of the economic success, I think it is important to note that for many baby boomers, they were actually able to live the American dream. So if we define the American dream as children being better off than their parents, people born in particular from 1940 to 1955 were much more likely to be more wealthy than their parents. The y-axis here is the percent of people who are richer than their parents. And that number has fallen off dramatically, such that by now, people are as likely to be less well off than their parents than they are to be more well off than their parents. So in terms of that specific family generational story, we see this economic inequality. We also see this in terms of a macro situation for these different generations where baby boomers and in fact Gen X were coming of age in their adult lives in very favorable economic conditions. And millennials are in a much worse situation. And so we were less likely to get good jobs, to accumulate wealth, buy houses, etc. But the fact that Gen X in some ways actually has a better economic situation than the baby boomers, according to this metric, is surprising, but it speaks to the fact that this boomer ballast is actually this multiplication. So sure, the economic circumstances were pretty good for Gen X, but there aren't that many of them. And so they don't have that multiplicative power over other parts of society that the boomers still do. Another way to visualize this is the wealth for each of these generations. Here we see millennials far, far worse off than the baby boomers. We can come back to any of these if you're interested, but I just want to run through the basic story here. So this graph's a bit too big, but in terms of mass political power, each subsequent generation becomes less likely to turn out to vote than the previous generation. So the dominant effect here is the percentage the people vote more as they get older, and that's still true. But even controlling for that, which we can see over a long time period, each subsequent generation at each point in the life cycle becomes less likely to vote and thus has less power in our democracy. We can see this in both the midterms and the presidential elections. So you might think that voting drops off beyond a certain point, and it sort of does, but actually people who are 80 are just as likely to vote as people who are 65, and they're both almost twice as likely to vote as someone who is 18. So this really speaks to, at the present moment, because there are so many baby boomers, they have so much political power. Let me just run through a few more of these points. So in terms of the representation, like we're very concerned about descriptive representation. The power of this one particular micro generation in terms of the major party nominees for the president is striking. So if we look at every single nominee since it's President Bill Clinton, and then from 2000 on, all of them were born in this very narrow age range. And so the one exception that I think helps my story is Obama versus McCain. These are the only two candidates in the past 20 years who were not born between 1941 and 1948. And this is the largest jump in terms of the relationship between age and support for the Democrat versus the Republican in post-war history. So I think this is evidence that there is a latent demand for younger politicians. And the one time where we actually have a gap and we have someone who was not born in the 1940s running for their president, youth turnout went up. And so if that were to happen again, it might happen again. But we are kind of stuck in this equilibrium where there's no representation for young politicians. And so young voters have a hard time getting excited. And so young politicians don't win primaries because young voters aren't excited to come out to the primaries and so on. Whereas the kind of central demographic heft of the baby boomers persist. So I break this down also by the House and the Senate. So we see on the left the kind of non-relationship between age age and the year of Congress. So there's not really much of a trend. Congress is neither getting older or younger on average in the pre-war, pre-boomer era. But as soon as the boomer turns 25, we see a pretty stark movement from the left in red to the right in blue over time. So as this baby boomer generation has been in the House and been the dominant force in the House, the average age of the House has gotten an additional 2 years older every session because it's the same people. The same people are just still there. And so we have now the oldest House in history. This trend is the case in the Senate as well. So it's basically the same story. And yeah, let me just run through my final point here, which is that the differential power of these different generations has led to what I theorize as cohort consciousness. So identity is now a very useful lens. Political scientists think about political behavior through the lens of identity all the time. And I'm making the argument in the book and in a paper co-authored with my colleague here at Penn State, Eric Plutzer, that generational identity is becoming a politically relevant identity. And so this really jumps out of the data in the 2020 Democratic primary, where there's just a massive difference between which politicians are being supported and age. So Biden, the ultimate nominee, was the first choice of approximately 0 people under 30, and yet still got the nomination. Whereas Bernie Sanders is the most popular one overall across people under 45. And so I track this in the cultural dominance of this single generation. So I think this is a fun analysis where we looked at all of the actors in major movies from 1900 to 2000, looking at the top 5 actors in each film. And we can trace the number of people in each decade here who are in these movies at different ages. So as we see over time, more and more of the people born in this 1940 to 1960 generation are appearing in movies. And so part of what this means is that we actually have a lot more people who are 60 and 70 appearing in major films, which is to some extent good for representation. There certainly were very few older people, and particularly older women, in films historically. But this also reflects on the demand side, the fact that the baby boomers have so much cultural power that they are able to have movies made for them, by them, and about them at every point in the life cycle. A slightly less data-driven approach, but I think this is just a perfect perfect analysis by XKCD suggests that the entire corpus of Christmas songs is about nostalgia for the baby boomers' childhood, that all of the major songs pioneered in this 1940s, 1950s period when the baby boomers were being born. So that is another slightly less data-driven representation of their cultural dominance. And so how does this play out in terms of cohort consciousness? I think, first of all, we see politicians explicitly appealing to different generations and their different experiences. So Bernie Sanders is here talking, reciting a very popular millennial talking point that the boomers had in terms of the amount of work at minimum wage they needed to do to get 4 years of public college, dramatically different. Whereas we have Joe Biden announcing that he has no empathy for the younger generation, telling him how tough they have it. And so I think this really encapsulates the different attitudes towards generations, and gives rise to generational resentment that is driving political action. So the first stage of demonstrating generational identity is if we ask people, what is your generation? Do they tell us? And on this, we actually see that the baby boomer generation has the highest level of generational identity. That is, among people born in that specific time period, how many of them adopt the label? Over 80% do. But we see that younger generations in general are less likely to, but Gen Z and millennials are more likely to actually act on this kind of question. So I think, and I'll close with this, the crucial question that we've adopted from the race and ethnic politics literature is about linked fate. So this question of linked fate is, how much does what happens to my generation matter to my life? That is my life outcome intensely tied up with the outcome for my group? And this has been used to study African-American politics for a long time. But on this dimension, we see that nearly 50% of Gen Z says that they have a high level of generational linked fate. And less than 5% of Gen Z says that what happens to their generation matters not at all. And so when we think about the most important issues for this generation being climate change, this is an issue which is indeed universal. And so the fact that they're worried about climate change and that they know that's going to be something that happens to all of them gives them a high degree of generational linked fate, and thus the ability to organize and act on this political issue. And I think we're already starting to see that. And the big story for the next decades, to me, in terms of the two-party system in American politics, is going to be which of the two parties is best able to switch direction and fully adopt the issues of younger generations, and which will continue to cater to the boomer establishment, which still runs them. So yeah, that's the those are my slides. Thank you for that great time period. And so, Charlie, I wanted to ask if you had any more questions, or if anyone else did. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry, I muted again to spare you baby noises. That was really fascinating. Thank you again for that unbelievable insight, and also for, as I said before, getting so much of that data in one place, which is a real feat. I want to sort of ask you this question of linked fate. In the graph that you just showed, and also in the book, you say that basically boomers have a more clearly defined generational identity than other generations do. Why do you think that is?
So one part of this is the connection to media, which is how I'm mostly a scholar of media and politics, and that's what got me interested in the generational discussion in the first place. So the boomers were quite influenced by the rise of television and mass media in the post-war era. And so they were born with a shared identity that was constructed in the broadcast era. So the pop music, the radio, and television were very important for forging this shared generational identity for the baby boomers. Whereas I think that younger generations are using the internet in interesting ways to define themselves, and they are generating generational identity in that way. But the internet and social media is inherently more fragmented than the kind of high broadcast era where everyone was consuming the same media. So even though millennials and Gen Z have a shared sense of being in the same boat together, their actual day-to-day lived world of media can be quite different even from other people in their generation because of the fact that there's just such a gigantic collection of media that they can choose from, and so have more niche interests.
And, to this point, one of the things that I think is really interesting is this question of sort of cultural power and political power. And you argue in the book quite persuasively that boomers have also held on to a lot of culture and media power. And yet there does seem to be a very sort of ascendant Gen Z and millennial driven culture, mostly on social media. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you see some of this political generational conflict to be about a youthful culture colliding with a geriatric institutional framework?
No, I think that's exactly it. And social media is crucial because it allows younger generations to bypass the legacy media institutions, which still are dominated by baby boomers. And so I think social media is even more radical because when the boomers were children, for example, they were consuming radio, television, this was made by older generations. And so the programming on TV is still encoding the cultural values and the just norms of how to live from previous generations. So the mechanism for intergenerational transmission went from family, extended family, to social networks, like real world meat space social networks. And then when there's media, you're still getting this contact because older people are making the media that young people are consuming. But what social media does is to short circuit that intergenerational transmission. And so social media is radical because it means that younger generations are able to create and consume media by, for, and about themselves, shutting older generations out of that process entirely. And this, I think, is leading to all forms of novel political ideologies, some of which are quite extreme, precisely because younger people are able to go off into their own worlds and are not held back by the kind of weight of tradition that has been passed on.
There's some folks in the audience that have some questions too, so I want to get to some of these. Armando asks, does the dominance of social media platforms among millennials and centennials serve as a distractor or a demotivator from political interest?
This is an interesting question. This is kind of hotly debated in the literature that the folks at CSMAP are quite influential in working on. So I think that we're still not quite sure about the answer. I would say that more of younger generations are aware of politics, that it is something they encounter a non-zero amount of on their social networks than they would have under previous media technology regimes. But that, so as a result, it might be more likely that they take some kind of actions. But in terms of the participation in organizations, the kind of things like political parties, where they're actually able to begin to develop organizational capacity and understand how to plan and organize and commit a long-term political strategy, or even in particular, getting involved in party politics and running for local races and then entering the pipeline of and becoming politicians. Being on social media doesn't help with that at all. And I can plausibly see it as distractor or competition. It draws people away from the central task of organizing and gaining political power.
Do you see, does any of your, Alan asks a question that I'm interested in as well. Does any of your research interrogate how this expands beyond the US? Do you see similar trends, generational trends beyond the United States?
This is useful because the comparative case helps nail down how, if things were different, how they would play out differently. So I think it is most dramatic in the US. So in a new working paper by Jake Grumbach and Adam Bonica about the dominance of old people in the political donor space, they do a comparative analysis, which I wish I had done, but they look at every single Congress or Parliament's legislative body in the world. Turns out the US has the oldest legislative body in the world right now, outside of Cameroon, apparently, which has a very specific situation. But it does mean the US is a positive outlier. And my primary explanation is precisely the two-party system. So in these parliamentary systems throughout most of Europe, it is possible to start third parties. And in most of Europe and lots of Latin America, there are third parties which are explicitly youth-driven parties. In many cases, they are green parties, which are focused on environmental issues. And so the ability for younger people to start to build political capital, to start to become, to grow an actual organization of political cadres, and they get political candidates. If they have a few seats in Congress, they're able to continue to consolidate and grow interest among younger generations. And because that has just not happened at all in the US, because the two parties are so tightly controlled by the baby boomers, this has really shut out younger generations to a greater degree and has allowed the boomer ballast to persist and these people to remain in power for longer.
To that point, I also wonder whether part of this might also be that, and again, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. To what extent is the baby boom itself an American phenomenon? Right? I mean, I actually don't know the answer to this. Did other countries have a similarly enormous and financially successful post-war baby boom?
Yeah, so a lot of the, I do know this in the case of most of the Anglo countries. So UK, Australia, Canada had baby boom. And in British politics, they're now called pensioners. So people who are on pension, it's a hot topic, and it's a cultural touch point there as well, where younger generations are upset at pensioners for continuing to own houses in central London and still whatever. So yes, that is the case just in terms of the demographics. In a lot of these countries, I think it does. I mean, in all of those cases, these are the kind of victors of World War II who emerged from that conflict relatively unscathed. Britain more than the US, Canada, Australia. But that means that in these places, in addition to the demographic boost, there was this burst of economic activity for this one generation, which has amplified their power. I don't know how that plays out in, let's say, German politics.
So we've got another question from Alan. What do you think this means for the two major parties? Hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think the implications of this trend are for the two major parties? It sounds like one party, from the data, it seems like Republicans do better with this older cohort. And yet you make a very persuasive argument that these boomers are going to be around for a long time, but they're not going to be around forever. So, right. So what do you think is the implication for each of the two parties and also for our two-party system?
So this is the big question. I would say, unfortunately, I wish it weren't such a central question, but which of the two parties blinks first and actually starts to embrace younger generations seems pretty key to me. And it, as you say, the Democrats should have an advantage, and they are kind of banking on demographic inevitability. But even if they're right, that won't really happen for a decade, maybe longer. So is that really a time scale that they should be happy working with? It's one question. But I also am particularly concerned by the Democratic Party simply being more organized, and the establishment is stronger in the Democratic Party. So the 2016 primaries are like a defining moment in our history of American politics. And the big difference was both the parties had an outsider challenger who was much more popular with younger generations. If you go back and look at the early polls, there was a pretty big gap between support for Trump. Trump had a lot more support from from older people. And the Cruz and Rubio had more support from younger people. That goes away because Trump kind of dominates the later primaries. So if you look on average, you don't see that trend. On the Democratic side, Bernie versus Hillary Clinton, a very dramatic gap in the age of their supporters. But the difference here was that the outsidery candidate in this case won in the Republican primary, because the Republicans have a primary system which has less control. So the kind of famous superdelegate system, which allowed the Democratic Party establishment to ultimately give the election to Clinton and then the nomination, reflects the Democratic Party's comparatively higher degree of control over their process. And so if the Republicans are actually, I would say, you might say that they're more dynamic and responsive to what people want. You might say they don't actually have any principles at all, and so are willing to do whatever comes along. However you want to put that, it might be the case that they are actually more adaptive, and that they will be the first party to really pivot to youth issues framed in their lens, if the Democrats are not willing to cede power to the next generation of Democratic politicians.
We've got another great question here. Do you think the boomers have a more patriotic association with voting since they're the most connected with World War II? Or is it that later generations are more disillusioned with government, which explains the lower vote turnout?
There's a lot of factors on the vote turnout. The one specific story is that the boomers were coming of age in the Vietnam era. So I think that is even a bigger kind of defining moment for them. And so this meant, for example, the passage of the, I want to say 21st Amendment, maybe it's 24th Amendment, whichever is the amendment which lowered the voting age to 18, right? It had been 21, but right when the baby boomers are at the young part of their life cycle is when they are able to wrest more political power towards themselves and kickstart the process of voter turnout when they're 18. So they're the first cohort of people to vote at a younger age, which I think helps build the habit and then the normative patriotic associations with voting throughout the life cycle. Overall, I do think that there is more, if you just ask a kind of survey question, how much do you think the United States is a good place or a good country? This is definitely something which differs by generation, and older generations rank higher on the scale.
I also want to add to your answer. I think I agree with everything you said. I also think there's a certain element of this that's just like voting is a habit. And when you start, you don't vote until you vote, so it's kind of almost like exercising, where there are a lot of people who don't exercise, and it's because they just haven't started exercising yet. Older people have had more time to pick up that habit. And to the point about the midterms, I don't actually, actually somebody else asked a question. I want you to answer it. Midterm voting predictions suggest that there will be a low voter turnout among young people, like in past years. Do you agree with this, and why not?
Yeah, so we've, it has been predicted every year for the past, however many elections. This is going to be the year where young people actually turn out to vote at higher rates. Every year there's something happening on social media where, oh, now young people are involved in politics. They're actually going to vote this year. And it just never happened. Even in 2020, which had a huge uptick in voter turnout across the board, the increase in voter turnout was higher among older generations than among younger generations. So even though there was an increase among younger generations, that's not the main story. The main story is that everybody turned out this election. So midterms, always much lower turnout for younger people than older people, even compared to presidential years. And it's not like, one of my predictions is that if we had younger candidates, people would vote for them more. And it's not like we have a bunch of now young candidates who we didn't have before. And so I don't see any reason to think we're going to see a big turn in political.
So to that point, Kevin, I love this conversation. I always think there's a lot of different interesting counter currents here. I mean, I think I want to push back on the 2020 thing. I mean, there's a lot of ways to read this data, right? But my understanding was that you're right that it was a huge turnout across the board, but in a couple states, like in Pennsylvania and in Michigan in particular, the youth margin was what put Biden over the top in those states. And he couldn't have won without, and in Georgia, it was Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Michigan. So to the person who asked the question, I share, Kevin, I share your skepticism about, like, yes, they always say this is the year that there's going to be a huge youth turnout, and like, I kind of doubt it. But to what we were talking about earlier, where voting is a habit, we've now had two elections, the 2018 election and the 2020 election, where a lot of young people registered to vote and voted. And so if I were a guessing person, which I'm not, I would say that we will probably have a similar level of turnout to those elections, maybe to the 2018 election, which was a very high turnout election for young people. So we'll see, but I do think that there's, I wonder also, to what extent do you think that this kind of boomer dominance is just really demoralizing to younger people and just makes them want to check out of the political system entirely?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a big part of the vibe, that it's really hard to get excited about choosing between these two 70-year-old guys for a lot of young people. And you see that discourse, and I mean, I'm excited to see more widespread discussion of the fact that the U.S. is really a historical anomaly and a cross-national anomaly in terms of how older politicians are. It wasn't always like this, and it's not like this everywhere else. So why is that happening, and can we do something about it?
But so I want to get your take on sort of an interesting wrinkle on this that happened in the 2020 primary, which is that you had Bernie Sanders, who was in that primary the oldest candidate, who had the overwhelming support of young people. And then you had Pete Buttigieg, who was one of the youngest people ever to run for president, certainly in recent memory, the youngest person in that primary, and young people hated him.
Yeah.
So what do you think that's about?
Well, Bernie is clearly an anomaly. Like, there's not many other politicians like him. And so that is kind of hard to explain. The Buttigieg case, I think, fits nicely in with literature on, for example, women in politics. So it's historically been much harder for women to become viable candidates. Once they are viable candidates, they're usually as likely to win as men are who are viable candidates. But in order for this to happen, the women who do succeed in becoming these candidates have to they have to run against type. So there's kind of a penalty for particularly feminine candidates in general. And the point is to kind of demonstrate that, in fact, you are just as tough as a man. You have to demonstrate that you are, to counteract the negative stereotypes, which are still dominant in mass politics. And so we're selecting a certain, when we're looking at descriptive representation by gender, we're selecting a certain type of women as the ones who are most likely to break these gender barriers. And so the Buttigieg case, I think, he was able to become the most successful, highest ranking millennial politician by playing precisely to the boomer type. So boomers love him. He's a clean-cut young man, very responsible, very respectable. And the millennials, I mean, just the kind of vibe of Pete Buttigieg is a completely annoying, goody two-shoes overachiever, which just does not really mesh with what kind of millennial desire for authenticity looks like. And so, yes, he's been able to succeed as a millennial precisely by being as little millennial-like as possible.
That's interesting. So do you, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I wonder, to that point, how do you think a millennial politician like AOC fits into that framework?
So, right. I mean, God bless her. She's such a perfect example. But the real question is, why aren't there more of her? Right? She's been wildly successful. And I use her in all of my conversations about social media and politics on new platforms because she's the only one using these places. And it's great for my arguments. But the counterexample is, why is she only one? Right? And so if we look at the story of how she came to Congress, she kind of won a surprise primary in a extremely non-competitive district. And that, I mean, has meant that she can be as, aggressive and as persuasive on social media as she wants, with little worry about losing to the Republicans. The counterexample that seems to be entering into the discussion was on the Republican side. I was always talking about Madison Cawthorn, who was, he won a very safe seat on the Republican side. He was a young congressman who was using social media very aggressively as well, using a distinctly millennial style on Twitter. But of course, he lost the primary, and I would say he just did it poorly. He did a bad job of it. So that you can use these new tools, and younger people seem to be better at it, or at least much more willing to do it in an authentic way. But you can use them poorly, or you can use them well. And it does still matter that you use them well in order to succeed. And AOC is an example.
One last question from our audience. Do you think the fact that Roe was overturned may, open the door for a woman president? Or do you think that and this is my adding on to this question, do you think that age is the fundamental stratifying organizing principle in our politics, or do other things like gender and race really complicate that? Adding on to the question.
Yeah, so the abortion and the gender situation is pretty specific and idiosyncratic compared to other issues. So, on most of the social issues I look at, there's a stark age divide. So support for gay marriage, support for marijuana legalization, all these issues, very striking gradient between the young and the old. On abortion, there's really not a trend by age.
Why
based
is that?
on I'm not really an expert on abortion. I don't really know, but it really stands out compared to the other social issues where there is a stark age divide, but on abortion there's not. So that's not really something I know, but it is a defining feature of politics and our two parties right now, for sure. I would still say that, age is very important. Generations are very important. I would say race is more important. But I would also say that right now, age and race are correlated. So you can't talk about age without talking about race, and vice versa. So although the country is much more diverse than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if we look at younger generations, they are way more diverse. And older generations are in some ways less diverse than older generations were 60, 70 years ago. And so,
Why is that?
well, so it's because the baby boomers are the whitest generation in American history. And this has a lot to do with both discrimination against Black Americans, and then the baby boomers, white baby boomers living longer than Black baby boomers. So now there's even, the racial diversity in this generation has gone down over time because of differential lifespans, and because there's been way more immigration than there was. So we're back to the historical trend of 15% foreign born in the US, but for the baby boomers, it was 5%. And so there really were way more immigrants when they were growing up than at any point in American history before or since.
There were way more immigrants when they were growing up?
Sorry, way fewer.
Way fewer. So, but just to ask a clarifying question about that, it makes sense to me that the baby boomers might be, is it that the baby boomers are more white than older generations, or is that just a question of who was able to vote? Because it was only, in the middle of the baby boomer lifespan,
right,
that voting rights were expanded, well beyond only white people. So is it that the generation itself is less diverse, or is it that the voters of this generation are like, how do you square that?
It's both. So it is the case that barriers to just explicit Jim Crow laws and making it impossible for Black people to vote has meant, because voting is a habit, that voter turnout is lower for Black Americans than white Americans at every generation, or at least among older generations. I'm quite sure of that. But it's also just the case that if we look at how many people are white based on birth year, that number is far higher for people in the baby boom generation than for millennials, Gen Z, or for previous generations. And so part of this is because the definition of white has changed over time, right? So we think about Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants. They were still racialized categories at that point. So they did not count as white. They were racially distinct and treated as such. And so that's why older generations are more diverse, because they were, in terms of the experience of being an Irish or Italian person, that wasn't being white. And so using that definition, that's how you get that.
Well, Kevin, I really appreciate you making time for this today. I want to hold up your book again so everybody can see it. It's so great. It does such a service to the study of generations in politics. It contains a lot of data and a lot of really interesting analysis that I think really moves this conversation forward. And I really want to thank you for the work you've done here.
Awesome.
And I want to take
It's been great.
And I want to take this opportunity on behalf of CSMAP to thank both Charlotte and Kevin for their time today. This was a fascinating discussion. Loved listening to you guys talk, and I learned a ton from being here. So thank you guys so much for taking your valuable time to join us here today. Thanks all of you, the audience who joined us here during your lunch, hopefully today. And just to reiterate, we'll have our final one of these 4 seminars will be next Wednesday at the same time. It's on Beyond Facebook and Twitter, the impact of new and niche platforms, something which I know is very dear to Kevin's heart as well. And we'll be joined by Parker Bach, Megan Brown from CSMAP, who's our chief research scientist, and David Thiel, and I'll be moderating the event. So hope to see many of you again here next week. And Charlotte and Kevin, thanks once again for your time. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. See y'all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.